Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to Midnight Nightmare. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the tale. But before that, please consider giving us a like. My day started just like all those before it that month. Dark, lonely. I got up around 7:30 like usual. Nothing was happening. Nothing ever was. November was always one of my favorite months, a gateway to winter. I usually only went in the woods in the winter time. Ticks scare me. You never know what they could be carrying. I live in a densely forested part of the United States, won't say where, but there's tons of forest, streams, rivers, etc. It was a very boring and lonely few weeks leading up to my decision. There was nothing going on and nowhere I had to be, so I decided I was going to go hunting. I collect guns and military gear, rifles, shotguns and handguns, backpacks, jackets, tactical accessories, etc. I've never been in the military, but I like this stuff. I wear combat trousers tied around my combat boots nearly every day. I chose all the basic stuff to take with me. Backpack, sleeping bag, tent, just all the necessary stuff to be out there. For my guns, I brought my Remington 1100 TAC-2 semi-automatic shotgun and my Ruger Super Red Hawk 44 Magnum revolver. I also brought a bottle of Sazerac whiskey and a small box of cigars. When I first picked up my gear, I realized how heavy it really was, but decided to carry on into the forest anyway. I left my house and began walking down the edge of my property towards the woods beyond. Everything was perfect at the start. Perfect temperature to note. A nice cool 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I always liked it cold. I picked a great day to start out. The sun was out, not a cloud in the sky, and it wasn't supposed to rain for the next week. Before I left, I had made myself my favorite sandwich for lunch. Honey ham, thick sharp cheddar cheese, and kettle chips, which I like on my sandwich. They give it a nice crunch. About 3 miles into my hike, I sat down on a downed tree and pulled out my sandwich. I had made it so I wouldn't have to prepare myself one of the MREs I brought, at least not until later that night. The forest was beautiful that day, birds chirping, and I didn't see too many deer, of course, from the leaves crunching underneath my boots. I had a long hike ahead of me, around 28 miles of forest, trying to reach a certain part of the forested land. I reached a creek and decided I would jump it, so I tried and failed. My boot hit the water, and my sock was soaked instantly. That put my day back pretty far, since the water was freezing and I had to stop and dry my boot out, which meant starting a fire. I couldn't continue with a freezing foot, so that was basically the end of my day. Before I set up my camp, I had to dry the damn boot out, so I collected some tinder, some round rocks, and lit a fire. I warmed the rocks up and stuck them in my boot so it would dry it out. I attempted to set up my tent with one boot on, but it just wasn't happening. So I decided I would just use my hammock for the night, so I set that up instead. The night air was cold and dry. The sounds of the forest around me, I fell asleep to the light of the fire. I awoke at some point in the night to a crash in the forest. I sat up sharp, frightened, but I figured it was most likely a falling tree. I fell back asleep soon after. The next day started well, but very cold. By this point, I was running low on water, so at some point I would have to boil some water today. I started down the trail, which wasn't really a trail, just a way I knew in the forest. It was about 11 a.m. when I decided if I was going to continue, I was going to need that water. Luckily, I was walking beside a nicely flowing creek, so I started a fire and gathered some water in the pot I had brought. My bag was large and heavy, because it had things I needed to be out in the forest for that long. The pot came to a nice rolling boil, so I removed it from the fire. I bottled my water and I was ready to continue. Before I was to continue, though, I thought I would have a cigar. This set my day back an hour and a half, so it was now midday, around 12:30 p.m. I heard something loud far off in the forest. An odd coincidence, I thought to myself, but I still had to press forward. It had been a while since I had eaten, so I found a nice spot by the creek with a nice amount of sunlight and began preparing myself an MRE. I always liked those things, regardless of things you see on the internet about them being nasty or tasteless. If you get the right one, they can be great. Chili and macaroni, one of the best. I began heating up my food in the heater bag, provided in the MRE. Hot food was a great motivator to carry on, really picking up the mood. High in calories, you really only need to eat one a day. I poured some of my drink mix into my bottle and picked up my gear. I started once again walking along the creek, just as I had before. After about 30 minutes of walking, I smelled something. A familiar smell. The smell of death. I was the curious type, so I naturally wanted to investigate. I followed the smell for a few minutes until I found its source. A deer carcass. What I was looking at was something I had never seen before. The carcass was missing its front legs and looked as if it had been turned inside out, almost unexplainable as it was just a mess. The intestines had been strewn everywhere, blood and fecal matter spread across the leaves and pine straw. What could have done this? I vocalized to no one in disbelief. The longer I looked, the higher the risk of losing my chili and macaroni was. I had to step away and compose myself. At first I thought maybe a bear, but there was no way this was a bear. The damn thing was eviscerated. I did some closer investigating and a thought popped into my mind. So I got closer, reached down, and stuck 2 fingers in between some folds of flesh. The fucking thing was still warm. It was time to go. I picked up my bag and began quickly down the edge of the creek. What the hell had I just witnessed? I wanted to get as far away from that thing as possible. Still shaken up about the previous event, I tried to forget about it, but it just kept me wondering. I was still about 20 miles from my destination, so I had to keep pressing on, for I only had about 3 hours of sunlight left. I reached a small clearing which I decided I was going to set up my small camp in for the night. I had about an hour of sunlight left and the creek was a short walk away. I walked towards the creek with my pot to collect some water, got to stay hydrated. When I made it back to camp, I set the water down and started my fire, which I had already collected the tinder for prior to going to get water. Daylight was fading quickly, so I set up my tent while the water was boiling. When I sat down by my small fire to take a breather and collect myself, I thought I heard something out in the woods which sounded like footsteps. Just an animal, I thought, but my mind wandered back to that deer I found earlier on in the day. Could it be a bear? I thought at first, but it was pretty far off and sounded like it was moving in a different direction, so I wasn't worried about it. I crawled into my one-man tent with the front flap open so I could see my fire, about 7 feet away. I cracked open the bottle of whiskey I had brought. It was cold just from the night air. I took a couple nips off of the bottle and settled in for sleep. I laid down, and a few seconds later a loud asterisk pop asterisk echoed through the forest, like a live tree branch breaking. It scared me a lot, so I grabbed my shotgun from the side of my bag. Already loaded, thankfully, I didn't want to make much noise. 12-gauge buckshot. My fire was just coals now, the dull glow illuminating the ground in front of me. I didn't hear anything else, but I sat there at attention. I wasn't going to get much sleep anyway. Ever feel like you're being watched? Yeah, you know that feeling? It's horrifying. Sometime in the night I dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was up, which was comforting. I checked around my camp to see if anything was different. Luckily, it wasn't. I tore down my tent and packed up my stuff. I had to get going. I was already going to have a late start. I started down the trail once again, just happy I was free from the troubles of everyday life. A couple hours into walking, I realized I wasn't familiar with this part of the forest, and I was curious to know where I was, so I climbed a nearby rocky hill. On my way up, I saw something odd, a rock overhang that didn't look right, so I went to check it out. After making my way around so I could see the front of the rocks, I saw it wasn't just an overhang, it was a cave. I've always been an explorer naturally, but sometimes I did some stupid shit, like going into unknown caves alone. If you fall down a crevice, you're dead no matter what. My curious nature wouldn't let me leave without seeing the inside of the cave first. I set my bag down and pulled out my mag light and walked towards the mouth of the cave. I shined my light inside the cave. A tunnel was illuminated and I was just too curious. I walked into the cave and began down the rocky tunnel. The tunnel began a left-hand turn which I couldn't see around. When I was able to, I saw it opened up into a room. The room wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either. The first thing I noticed was the smell, musk and rot. The second thing I noticed were the bones. They were everywhere. I thought it must have been a mountain lion den, but I wasn't worried, not with my .44 Magnum. I shined my light around the chamber, didn't see anything living, so I walked further in. My light fell on an opening at the other end of the chamber, another tunnel. I walked around the first chamber, seeing what I could find. That's strange, I thought, as I had found pieces of clothing lying around. A bright orange jacket, shredded and stained with black splatter. Maybe a discarded jacket that a hunter had skinned a deer in, and the lion had dragged it back to the den because it smelled like deer blood. I wasn't exactly ready to try to venture further into this cave, but I pressed on a little ways. I'm just too curious. Bones crunching underneath my feet, I walked to the second tunnel, and it went off into the dark and split into two paths. The ceiling in here was quite high, so the darkness just ate my light. I decided to turn back. It was starting to get dark and I needed to find a spot to set up camp. I stood at the entrance to the cave for a minute to compose myself. I had a quick smoke and began to look for a spot to pitch my tent. I found a nice flat spot and started cooking my MRE while I set up my tent. I began eating my meal just inside the tent with the flap open, and yet again I heard something, like human feet, 1 2 1 2 1 2. What was strange was the distance of the sounds, the distance between each footfall, at least 10 feet between every crunch of the leaves. They were very close. I hadn't lit a fire so I couldn't see anything, and I didn't dare turn on my flashlight as I didn't want to alert whatever or whoever was out there. I was miles into the woods, so seeing another person at this time of evening was very strange. I waited a while with my shotgun and I didn't hear anything else, so I went to sleep. Foolish. I didn't hear anything else, meaning I didn't hear it move away from me. I woke up to breathing outside my tent. I was mortified. The breathing was high up, like it was in a tree or something, but it was loud. I picked up my shotgun, which was laying beside me, and sat up slowly. The breathing continued as I sat there motionless. It had not occurred to me before then, but I had left my tent flap open, not that it would help much being closed. I clicked the crossbar safety on my shotgun off. It clicked a little louder than desired, as the gun was fairly new, and the breathing seemed to move closer to the surface of the tent, and I could almost hear sniffing. I was paralyzed with fear, gripping my shotgun in a death grip. Then it hit me. I was breathing very lightly through my mouth until now, and I took a deep breath through my nose. The smell of carrion and rotting flesh filled my nostrils as I winced from the smell. At that moment, I realized I was going to die if I didn't do something. I carefully slipped my .44 Magnum out of my bag, tucked it into my waistband, and picked up my flashlight. I listened for the breathing, and I aimed my shotgun at the roof of the tent where I heard the breathing coming from, took a deep breath, prepared myself, and fired. A thunderous roar emanated out through the still air, and I would have pissed myself if I wasn't already in motion. I bolted from the tent, clicking my light on as I ran through the forest. The creature roared again as I heard thunderous footsteps behind me, quickly closing the distance. Trees snapped and fell as the creature gave chase. I quickly changed direction and bolted right, jumping the creek with the adrenaline coursing through my veins. It had momentarily lost track of me, so I took the chance to turn around to defend myself. I shined my light around in the area I heard it, and I spotted what was chasing me. In the very short moments that I got to look at it, what I saw horrified me beyond belief. The thing was at least 15 feet tall, bipedal, with pale gray skin. Its head was similar to a dog's head, but much larger and longer. Spiraling horns shot out from the top of its head, each at least 3 feet long. Long, sharp scythe-like claws on its hands and feet. Pale jet-black eyes trained on me, it charged me. Beginning to close the distance rapidly, I raised my shotgun and unloaded the tube into the beast's chest. 5 shots. Thank God I had bought an extended tube for my shotgun. The beast roared in pain but seemed only stunned by the shots. I turned and began to run yet again, trying to put as much distance between myself and the beast before it came to its senses and began to give chase. I ran faster than I ever had before. I slowed down momentarily, fumbling in my pocket for more shotgun shells, and luckily I found some, 4 1-ounce slugs. I loaded them into my gun, trying not to drop any as I jogged through the forest, holding the light between my teeth. A thought came to me. I remembered my light had a strobe function. Maybe it would disorient it, I thought as I ran. My heart dropped as I heard a roar and heavy footsteps pounding the forest floor towards me. I switched my flashlight to strobe and turned to face the beast. Through the flashes of light, I saw the creature making 10-foot bounds towards me on all fours. I focused the light in its eyes as I assumed it was mostly nocturnal in the moments I had enough time to think. The beast slowed down drastically as it tried to cover its eyes, fumbling to its right and ramming into a tree. It roared in anger, stood up on its hind legs, and splintered the medium-sized maple tree with its claws. I raised my shotgun, blasted all 4 slugs into the creature's torso. It roared in pain but again seemed relatively unfazed. I reached for more shells but found none. I had left them in my bag, which I had ditched when I ran from the tent. I still had a .44 Magnum and a pocket full of rounds. I drew my .44 from its holster on my hip, pulled the hammer back, and nailed the creature once in the head. The results from the shot ended in making the beast angrier. It threw its arms to its sides and roared a primal roar of rage and charged. I bolted right around a large pine tree as the beast was nearly on top of me. It smashed the tree with its claws, sending chips of wood flying at me. I dodged in between trees as I ran from it yet again. I turned yet again, hitting in the eyes with my strobe light, stunning it momentarily. I had no idea how far I had run, but I pressed on. The sun was beginning to rise, overcast clouds in the sky. Vision was gradually improving, working to my advantage. Still being trailed by the creature as I ran right out of the tree line and directly into a road. I had never been so happy to see pavement in my whole life. The sight of something man-made filled me with determination, as I had no intent of being shredded today. There was no way I could avoid it in the open, so I darted back into the tree line and began to run along the tree line down the road. I turned once again and unloaded the rest of my cylinder into the creature. It jerked in pain and frustration as I began to increase the distance between us. Then I saw it. Headlights in the distance, maybe a mile out. I was running towards it as it was driving in my direction, so the distance was closed quite quickly. When it was about 200 feet away, I ran from the tree line in front of the truck, a 1970s Chevy. It pulled closer and began to slow down as I ran towards it, yelling. The driver must have seen the creature running after me and screamed for me to jump in the bed, which I did. The truck tires screeched as it peeled away. We began picking up speed as the creature gave chase. It began to bound and leap on all fours as I opened the cylinder on my revolver and began to load each round. Just as I closed the cylinder, the creature had gotten close enough to reach the truck, slashing at the back of the vehicle, smashing the tailgate off. I unloaded the gun into the creature's face as it fell backwards. Unable to pick up enough speed to catch the truck again, it roared and bounded back into the forest from which it came. I sat back in the bed of the truck and began to laugh as the distance between that thing and I increased. Just glad I was able to escape with my life. If you're ever alone, deep in the woods, and feel like you're being watched, you probably are. The drive out took a few hours. As I pulled off the main highway and onto the branching road, I was struck with the sense that I was going to be very alone out here. I'm an avid hiker, but since many of the hiking trails I'd normally frequent had become almost crowded as of late, for this trip I'd settled on a trail I'd vaguely heard of but knew next to nothing about. It'd lead up towards some serious wild territory, with nothing around for hundreds of miles. The land was technically part of one of the nearby national parks, but was only barely mentioned on the park's website. I suspected this was because it was much further out than the regularly visited trails, only accessible from a branching road that pretty much led to nowhere. My plan was to head into the wilderness and camp out overnight under the stars. I live in a desert state. No, I won't tell you which one. And I figured there'd be some stunning views of the constellations in the cloudless sky at night, especially since it was forecast to be a moonless night. I'd already walked the popular day trails in the area, so I was looking into for something a bit farther afield. The plan was to camp out under the stars and head back in the morning. The deserted road suggested I was right in thinking that nobody came this far out. Should be a good chance to relax and get away from it all. Eventually, I reached my destination and pulled off the asphalt of the road and into the gravel of the parking area, tires crunching as I slowed to a stop off to one side. Parking lot would have been too generous a title. It was really just an unsealed area next to the highway with a signpost announcing the entrance to National Park territory. The area was almost empty, only a single other car parked up. I got out and stretched, looking around and spotting the low sign that marked the trailhead. As I did, I took a second glance at the other parked car. It looked like it had been there for an age. All 4 tires were flat, although they didn't look to be punctured. Every surface was dusty. I looked back at my car, which was lightly coated from the drive-in, but this was well and truly caked on. There were no broken windows, and it didn't look like it had been stolen and dumped. It didn't look damaged at all. Must have been there a while, I thought to myself, wondering why no one from the Park Service had had it towed by now. I made a mental note to call them when I got home. I opened the door to my back seat and got out my pack, hat, and rifle. I'd thought hard about whether to bring the rifle. It was extra weight after all, and odds were I wouldn't need it. But last time I'd been out hiking overnight, I'd had a far too close encounter with a coyote that had left me wishing I had something more than rocks to protect myself with. I figured since it was only a small .22 caliber, it wouldn't be too heavy, and I'd packed it into a light soft case that had fit alongside my pack. I reached into my pack for my sunscreen and slathered some on my arms and neck before turning off my phone. I'd called my sister before I left town to let her know my plans, and stowing it and my keys away, shouldering my things and setting off up the trail. I'd gone no more than a couple of 100 yards when I slowed to a stop, nose in the air. There was the slightest breeze, but with it came the hint of something behind it. I winced as the warm air hit my face because the smell it wafted towards me was terrible. "Smells like something died," I muttered to myself. The breeze died down and the smell went with it. "Ugh," I said, setting off again and picking up the pace. I couldn't see any buzzards around, but if there was something dead nearby, I didn't want to be anywhere near it if the wind kicked up again. The hike-in was uneventful. I won't bore you with all the details, but it was great terrain, a clear and easy trail through the desert shrubland. Some hours in, I was breathing hard as I reached a slightly hillier bit of the trail. I came to the top of the rise and saw that the terrain flattened out ahead into a wide plateau. Looking at the sun, I saw it was mid-afternoon, and decided this was as good a place as any to set up camp for the night. I walked another few minutes before stepping off the trail, spotting a nice flat bit of land where the brush had been cleared away. There were the remnants of a campfire in the center, just a few bits of charcoal and some scorched ground. I nodded to myself, taking off my pack and rifle case and placing them on the ground near the old campfire. I spent over an hour bringing in firewood, and another half hour breaking it all up into manageable pieces. There was plenty around, lots of low, dead bushes and shrubs around the place. I wanted enough wood for the fire to last easily through the night. The sun was just starting to go down and it was beginning to get a bit chilly. I stood back and looked at my wood pile. It was quite impressive, and probably way more than I'd actually need. Better safe than sorry, I shrugged to myself. The last rays of daylight were peeking over the horizon as I lit the fire, building it up until it was crackling away merrily. I ate a couple of power bars I'd packed as a cold dinner, swigged some water and sat on the ground looking up at the stars coming out, feeling very peaceful. That feeling didn't last very long. I heard the wind pick up before I felt it. It whistled between the rocks and shrubs, seeming to whirl around, passing me and then doubling back before arriving. It brought a warmth with it that was odd for the desert at night. That wasn't the only thing it brought, though. I sniffed as the breeze kicked up the flames in my little campfire and screwed up my face. That stench I'd smelled earlier came with it, hot and rotten, like roadkill baking under the sun. I gagged and tried to hold my dinner down. The campfire flared up as the wind hit it, throwing sparks in the air. I watched as they floated into the sky, bright orange spots against the black, almost blending in with the stars. As they burned themselves out, the wind died down, the flames it had kicked up lessening as well. The stench had died back as well. It was still there in the background, but not being blown in my face anymore. Once the light from the flare-up had dimmed, everything seemed a lot darker. I looked around and shivered involuntarily, realizing just how dark it suddenly was. I looked up at the sky and wished I hadn't chosen a moonless night for my hike, looked back towards the fire and then stopped dead. Something was wrong. I blinked hard and looked up again at the sky. The stars. The stars were gone. One second they'd been there and the next they just weren't anymore, as if the wind had blown them out like they were candles. There was nothing overhead, just a sudden blackness all around, seeming to press in against dome of light that my little campfire was throwing out. "The hell?" I exclaimed, looking about me. The air hadn't changed temperature. It was still cool but not cold, but an icy sense of unease was settling over me. I shivered again and tossed a couple of branches on the fire, then drew my jacket closed and zipped it up. Where before I'd been able to faintly see the outline of the scattered shrubs and boulders by the faint starlight, now I couldn't see a thing. There was no horizon anymore. The suddenly black sky blended in completely with where I knew the mountains in the distance were, and I couldn't see anything in the darkness that was pressing in around me. I grabbed my pack and pulled out my phone, turning it on and quickly navigating to the flashlight app. The phone's flash lit up and cast a harsh light on the ground, and then flickered and died, the phone turning itself off again. I pressed the power button again, but the screen stayed stubbornly black. Shit, I thought to myself, reaching back into my pack for my keys. I found the pen light on my keyring and turned that on, which also immediately flickered and turned off. I whacked it a couple of times to no avail before giving up in disgust and stowing my keys and phone back in my pack. I looked around me, shivering with unease again. It was very dark. I couldn't see more than 20 feet on either side of the fire. It was almost as if the light was being forced back in on itself. I couldn't hear anything other than the crackle of the campfire. The whistling of the wind had stopped. That god-awful smell was still in the background, though, like there was something dead nearby, and what the hell was that? I heard a noise, like someone clearing their throat, a thick, wet heh. My stomach dropped, my breath catching in my throat for a second. I wasn't alone out here. Looking in the direction the noise had come from, I saw a small flash in the darkness, and then another. A tingle ran up the back of my neck as I realized there was something out there, sitting just outside of the reach of the light from the campfire, watching me. My sister has a little dog, and I remember staying with her once and it looking at me from a dark room down the hall while I was in the brightly lit lounge. I couldn't see it at all, but I knew it was there from the way the light bounced off its eyes, dim yellowy pinpricks in the darkness about a foot off the ground. What I saw was like that, only instead of the eyes in the dark being knee-height like my sister's dog, these were 6 feet off the ground. Too tall to be a coyote or even a mountain lion, I thought to myself almost absently, trying to control the fear that was bubbling up inside me. "Yeah, get out of here," I yelled, standing and waving my arms in the air. It didn't leave. Instead, the eyes came down a couple of feet, like the thing had lowered its head. I slowly moved to put the campfire between me and it moved in turn. I kept moving around the fire and it kept moving too. I stopped and stared at it and it stopped and stared right back. Something else was strange. My feet had crunched the gravel as I turned to face it as it circled, but it made no sound at all as it moved. The darkness hid all but the barest outline, and even that was fuzzy at best. Apart from what I assumed were eyes, all I could see was a slightly darker spot in the blackness. Crouching, I picked up a rock and chucked it in the direction of the eye flashes. The rock sailed through the air and I lost sight of it in the darkness, but I'd swear my aim was dead on. It didn't hit anything. I just heard a crunch as the rock fell to the gravel and tumbled away. The flashes in the darkness bobbed up and down slightly. Whatever it wasn't afraid of me, and it seemed to be moving closer. Slowly, very slowly, I reached for the rifle case, unzipping it and taking out my little .22. I pulled the bolt up and back and then forward and down again, chambering around. As I did, the thing moved again, the eyes coming back and slightly lower, as if it was coiling back on itself, like a cat ready to pounce. I moved my thumb to disengage the safety, pulling the stock tightly into my shoulder and aiming for where I guessed the thing's center mass would be, a bit more than a foot below where the glint of the eyes were. "Don't make me use this," I yelled at it again. "Just go away." I heard a wet sound like a growl from a dog crunching food in its mouth, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The sound from my little rifle seemed deafeningly loud, splitting the quiet of the night like lightning splits the sky. I lowered it slightly, peering over the barrel towards the thing. It hadn't moved at all after coiling back. It had stayed right there, ready to pounce. But there was no way I'd missed it, not at this range. Work the bolt back, I frantically thought to myself. Get another round and re-aim, squeeze the trigger, crack. Work the bolt, aim, squeeze the trigger, crack. Again, crack, again, crack, again, click. The hammer came down on an empty chamber. My ammunition was spent. I'd only packed the single 5-round magazine and I had nothing to reload with. I hadn't counted on needing any more than that. The thing shifted slightly, growling again as it moved. The flash from its eyes in the firelight disappeared, and I lost sight of its outline. I lowered my rifle with shaking hands, switching my grip to clutch the still warm barrel like a club, ready to swing the stock into whatever that thing was. Thump! Something solid hit me in the back and I screamed as I spun on the spot, swinging the rifle like a bat. It whooshed through the air, hitting nothing. I took a step back, breathing hard as I saw that familiar glint in the dark, just beyond the border of where the light from the fire showed. It had gotten behind me in seconds and I hadn't heard it move at all. But what had hit me? if it hadn't come into the light. I looked down, and lying at my feet was a single hiking boot. I glanced back up towards the thing. It hadn't moved. It was just there, watching me. I looked back at the boot, which wasn't in the best shape. The fabric was torn and it was caked in reddish-brown mud. Hang on, I thought, stooping to pick it up. I shifted it closer to the fire for a closer look. Blood. The boot was caked in dried blood. My head swam and a fire tore through my nerves, the back of my neck prickling madly and my skin turning to gooseflesh. I found myself on one knee, breathing heavily as I mumbled, "Oh shit, oh shit." I looked back up towards the thing, which still hadn't moved. I stood and screamed at it, "What do you want with me?" It didn't answer. I dropped the boot. I jumped as there was a small pop from one of the branches in the fire, but was suddenly struck by an idea. I moved closer to the fire and spotted a branch that only had one end alight. I pulled it from the blaze and turned to face the thing. It growled again as I held up the branch, which rose to more of a snarl as I threw it towards it. The blazing stick lit up the night as it tumbled through the air towards the thing, and a horrified thrill ran up my spine as I caught a better glimpse of the outline of it, just for a second before it scuttled away from the light. It was huge, big as a bear but without any of the mass, lean as opposed to bulky. It was dark, so dark that it seemed to flow and blend into the gloom behind it. It had 4 long legs attached to an almost stumpy torso, but it hadn't used all 4 when it moved. It used the front ones, arms, to push itself upright onto the back legs and then danced madly away on those while its whole body and arms jerked from side to side. God, it was so tall, maybe 8 feet high when moving on its back legs, and it never seemed to get fully upright. The things that glinted in the firelight did seem to be its eyes, and the split-second glimpse of its face I caught was enough to make me take a step back in horror. It looked almost human but deathly wrong, like if you took a person's face and stretched it forward so it was long, like a horse's head. The mouth, though, it wasn't small like a horse's. It stretched all the way back to where the face met the rest of the skull. The mouth was stuffed full of far too many rotten-looking teeth, stained red in places. I think my legs gave way then. I found myself sitting on the ground, hugging my knees and rocking back and forth. What in the hell was that thing, and what did it want with me? The blood-stained boot didn't exactly fill me with hope that it was friendly. I used a shaking hand to grab some more sticks out of my woodpile and feed the campfire. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't come into the light, and it had moved away when the fire came near it. I gave a silent thanks to whatever urge had made me drag in as much wood as I had. The eyes had stopped moving again, and it seemed the thing was content for the time being just to sit in the dark and stare at me. I stared right back, trying to think of what the hell I was going to do, and we stayed like that for a while looking at each other. Somewhere not too far away, a coyote howled. The eyes turned and bobbed up and down slightly in the direction of the howl. Was it sniffing the air? It turned back to face me and it grunted. Whatever the noise was, it sounded dissatisfied somehow. The thing turned away again and I saw the barest smudge of an outline moving off into the dark towards the howls. Within seconds it was gone from sight, and as it faded from view, so did its stench. I sat there, frozen for a moment, and then burst upwards, boots scrabbling for grip on the loose gravel as I came to my feet. I frantically grabbed at my pack and swung it onto one shoulder, stooped to pick up my rifle and swung that by its strap onto the other shoulder, and then hesitated, torn by indecision. Dare I risk it? I clenched my jaw and tried to swallow down the rising sense of fear. I picked up one foot and took a single step away from the fire, wincing as the gravel crunched underfoot, which seemed deafeningly loud in the silence that was broken only otherwise by the fire. I peered around, muscles tensing with anticipation, but saw no sign of the thing. I took another step. The gravel crunched again, still no sign of it. I relaxed ever so slightly, took a deep breath and started briskly walking towards the trail. Once I hit it, I could turn right and I was confident enough I could follow it back to the parking lot, even in the dark. I'd taken no more than a half-dozen hurried steps when I stopped dead, frozen in place. I could smell it again, the reek bringing the bile up in my throat. Heart racing, I turned my head slightly to the left and saw that glint in the dark. The light from the fire had dimmed as I'd moved away from it, but I was still just close enough for me to see that familiar reflection of the flames in its eyes again. A rumble came out of the darkness, a growl. I slid my front foot backwards, slowly moving back towards the fire, never taking my eyes off where it seemed to be in the dark. I reached the fireside and slid my pack and rifle off my shoulders, laying them on the ground and sitting down next to them. As I did, I heard the coyote howl again. The thing seemed to grunt, and then it faded into the darkness as it turned away from me. What the hell was I going to do? It was like the thing was playing with me, but I wasn't going to risk making a run for it again. No way did I want it to catch me in the dark. The darkness had seemed to kill my phone and flashlight when it settled in, and any flaming torch from the fire I took would burn out well before I made it back to my car. I still had my lighter, but there was no way that'd make enough of a difference to keep it away. The coyote began to howl once more, but the howl cut off quickly, turning into a snarl. I listened closely as the snarls became pained and then desperate yelps, and held my breath as they cut off, replaced by the sounds of something snapping, crunching, and splattering. I breathed deeply, listening as I tried to slow my hammering heart down. Nothing. Once again, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. I shut my eyes, listening harder, and shrieked as something hit the ground next to me, scrabbling backwards on my butt away from it, waiting for it to leap up and grab me. I'd gotten a few yards away when I stopped scrabbling and just sat there hyperventilating, staring at the ruined pile of gray fur and red gore that lay in front of me. It was the coyote. Or what was left of the coyote. It was a mess. It looked like every bone in its body had been pulverized and its front legs were completely missing, but raggedly missing, like they'd been torn away rather than cleanly cut or bitten off. Worst of all, its head was facing the wrong way, twisted around until it was entirely backwards. Blood seeped from the open mouth, collecting into drops that each hit the dusty gravel with a soft splat. I shuddered and hugged my knees tight, rocking back and forth slightly. This must have been the coyote I'd heard howl earlier, the one the thing went after. Oh shit, I stood. Where was it now? I circled on the spot, looking out into the dark. There, on the other side of the fire, just beyond the border where the light ended, that familiar reflective yellow double flash. It was still watching me. "Fuck you!" I screamed at it. I strode to the dead coyote, grabbed it by its still warm tail and swung it around, casting it away from the fire towards the thing. It flumped to the ground not too far away from where the light ended. The thing didn't move. I fought to get my breathing under control, kicking dust over the small patch of blood that had pooled where the coyote lay. I looked at my hands and they were sticky with blood too. I grabbed my water and rinsed the worst of it off, wiping my hands on my pants to dry them. I heard a grunt and turned to see one long, impossibly thin limb reaching in from the shadow to grab the dead coyote by the tail, slowly dragging it out of the light. It was hard to see any detail. It was almost as if it was radiating the darkness out from itself, but I could see that it seemed to end in a hand that again looked human, but wrong. The fingers were way too long, and they were jointed in too many places. It looked like someone reaching out with a collection of tarantula legs on the end of a stick. It made a pained sort of sound while it was doing it. Maybe the light hurt it? The coyote disappeared from view, leaving bloody drag marks in the dust, and I heard horrific ripping and squelching sounds. I guess the thing was tearing it apart and eating it. The eating noises eventually stopped, and the thing grunted, but it sounded unsatisfied somehow. It went back to staring at me. Whatever this thing was, it wanted me, not just the coyote. I picked up some more branches and built up the fire, then sat down and stared at the reflective eyes in the dark. I don't know how long I sat like that for. It must have been hours. I built up the fire a couple more times and went back to staring at the thing. It'd grunt or growl every now and again, but then it shut up. For the time being, it seemed satisfied just to sit and stare. Eventually, I found my blinks getting longer each time it was harder to open my eyes again. God, I was so tired. The adrenaline spike had long since worn off and I felt wiped out. Just a second, I'll just close my eyes for a second, I thought to myself, as my head began to nod forward. I jerked bolt upright and wide awake at the thrill that ran up my spine as I heard a wet, throaty heh from behind me. I'd fallen asleep. The fire had burned down low and was mostly just embers, only emitting a faint glow, just enough for me to see that the thing had crept much closer as the light had diminished. I must have dozed off for an hour or more, Leaping to my feet, I grabbed some branches from the pile and hurled them into the remnants of the fire, and then fell to my hands and knees so I could frantically blow into the embers, desperately trying to stir them back into life. The light flared up as they caught alight, and I saw it sitting there, way too close, squatted on its haunches like a dog sitting. Long back legs folded up so what I assumed were knees were up by the shape of its head, and arms extended down to the ground in front of it, holding its torso upright. The light glinted from its eyes as it shifted its head to stare at me again, and it hissed as it pushed itself backwards, retreating from the light. As I lost sight of it in the darkness, I heard that wet sound again, like a long tongue smacking against lips. I shuddered. I'd gotten a better look at its eyes in the light this time. They were filled with hunger and pain. But there was an intelligence there. Human eyes, not entirely those of an animal. It went back to looking at me, only this time it wasn't silent. It kept growling and grunting, and the noises it was making grew in volume and frequency. It almost sounded desperate. It circled the fire, eyes disappearing from view, and then reappearing elsewhere where it'd growl from the dark, but it never came into the firelight. I didn't say anything. I just fed the fire and hoped that my stock of firewood would hold out a little longer. I'd brought a lot in, but it was diminishing by this point. Then finally the thing made a noise I hadn't heard yet, a hiss higher in pitch than anything else it had made, and it looked up at the sky before staring at me once more. It made a disgusted sort of noise and then turned away. I heard the wind kick up and I could smell the thing's stench again, and then all of a sudden it was just gone. As the thing went, the smell and the suffocating darkness went with it, and I realized I could see clearly around me again. The sky had that deep dark blue color you see before sunrise, and I could see a few pinpricks of light that could only have been stars. It got progressively lighter and lighter until, there, the sun peeked up over the horizon, and I'd never been as happy to see the light of day as I was now. I waited another hour and a half until the sun was well in the sky and things were starting to heat up before I dared to make a move. I picked up my things and got the hell out of there, shuddering as I passed the remnants of the coyote. Just a bloody patch of gray fur and shattered bones. I jogged the whole time, never pausing, never stopping, and never looking behind me. Every time I slowed, I'd hear the wind whistle again and I'd catch a whiff of something foul, so I'd pick up the pace again. Hours later, I was just about ready to drop when there, the start of the trail. I could see down to the car park. Without stopping my jog, I reached back and pulled my backpack off, holding it in one hand and awkwardly cradling the gun case in my other arm as I scrabbled in the pack for my car keys. I almost tripped as the hard trail gave way to the gravel of the car park, but managed to keep my footing as I scrabbled towards the car. I fumbled with the keys for what seemed an age, before throwing open the door, tossing my things across and slinging myself into the driver's seat, both hands gripping the wheel with a white-knuckled grip. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, and was taken aback at the haggard, wild-eyed figure that stared back at me. There were rivers of clear skin in the dust caking my face. I realized I'd been sobbing with relief since I'd been able to see the end of the trail. I looked back out at where the trail started, and saw the dust from the path swirl as the wind picked up once more. I hurriedly rammed the keys into the ignition. I gunned the engine, throwing the car into gear, pulling around quickly and peeling out onto the road. As I sped back towards the city, it wasn't until I hit the main highway before my heart stopped pounding and my breathing slowed to normal levels. A few hours later, less time than it took to drive out there, I was not doing the speed limit. I was home, with my doors locked and the sunlight streaming in through the windows. My phone turned on after I'd plugged it in. "Now you work." So I messaged my sister so she wouldn't call search and rescue. A day or so later, I called the Park Service and told them that I'd been stalked by some mountain lions on the trail, and they removed the area from the information section of their website. Nobody really went there anyway, they said. I didn't mention the abandoned car or the bloody boot, and didn't tell anyone what had really happened. And after all, who would have believed me if I did? There was no point in sending anyone else into danger. Later, I started reading up on some local folklore, but stopped pretty quickly. I came across something that made me start to shake at the description of it. I'm fairly sure I now know what the thing was, but I decided I wouldn't look any more into it, and I'd just try to put it all out of my head. It hasn't really worked. My breath catches in my throat every time I go into a dark room while I fumble around for a light switch. I don't hike much anymore. If I do go hiking, then it's strictly along well-used trails, and I never ever do an overnighter. I had work transfer me to a branch a long way away from the desert. I couldn't deal with feeling a hot wind anymore. I'm somewhere where it snows now. My encounter left me with a lot of unanswered questions, but one question ranks above all the rest, and it's something I'm not really sure I want to know the answer to. If that thing I read about is real, then what else is real and hiding out there in the dark? For many years, I, Matt, reveled in the silence of this forest. Throughout my life, I had grown accustomed to its whispers, knowing every tree, every pathway, as well as my own fingers. I was a guardian of the forest, a person who connected with nature on a level that others could only dream of. My morning routine began with awakening to the melody of bird songs. I loved that sound. It reminded me that each new day welcomed me into the embrace of this green kingdom. After dressing as I stepped out of my modest cabin, I was greeted by the cool morning air saturated with the scent of freshness. My work was a part of me, and I was a part of it. I monitored the condition of the forest, checked the health of the trees, and cared for biodiversity. Being a forester was not just a job for me, it was a calling. My communication with these wise trees, green leaves, and lively streams made me happy. People might have thought that such a life was monotonous, but for me, it had its own rhythm, its own harmony. This forest became my home, and I was its guardian. My days passed in tranquility, and it seemed that nothing could disturb this idyllic existence. However, fate had something in store for me that would change all my foundations. And so it began. At first, I didn't pay much attention to these strange tracks, hoping they were simply the result of some wild creature passing by randomly. However, the longer I observed them, the more they turned into a puzzle I couldn't ignore. These tracks were unlike anything I had ever seen. They were too large for foxes or raccoons, and too unusual to belong to a bear. None of the animals known to me in this forest could leave such prints. My knowledge of the local fauna was impeccable, but these imprints defied the usual order. I started waking up at night, thinking about these tracks. They haunted me in my dreams, leaving a strange residue of unease. I traversed the forest back and forth, trying to find some logical explanation, but they simply didn't fit into the picture of this world. Perhaps it was some new species that I was not familiar with. I delved into my books, flipping through pages, but found nothing similar. My anxieties intensified with each passing day. It felt as if something unfathomable had penetrated this forest, casting a shadow of the unknown over it. The more I sought logic in these strange tracks, the more they became mystical. They seemed to pursue me, getting closer to my cabin. In the evenings, when the forest fell silent, I heard rustling in the bushes, and something heavy moved around, leaving behind these enigmatic traces. An unknown presence hung in the air, like a ghost you can't see but feel is there. I felt as though I were being watched, and this thought haunted me. At night, I heard footsteps around the cabin, but upon going outside, I found no one. My nerves were stretched to the limit. During the day, I tried to focus on my work, taking care of the forest, but when night fell, strange sounds and tracks returned like ghosts from the past. I began to lose sleep, and every rustle put me on edge. Fear seized me, and I realized that this was something much darker than I could imagine, something that defied explanation in scientific terms. I knew I couldn't remain in this state of anxiety. Answers needed to be found before the shadow of this unknown completely consumed me. The night became even more ominous as strange sounds echoed around the cabin. Unidentified whispers and rustlings penetrated the darkness of the forest, as if nature itself was murmuring incomprehensible secrets to me. These sounds stirred anxiety, and my ability to discern their nature only heightened my unease. One morning, upon waking up, I noticed that the phone line connecting me to the outside world had been severed. My gaze fixated on the severed wires leading to my cabin. This was more than just strange noises in the night. Someone or something seemed to have deliberately cut my last tether to reality. Through the dense foliage of the forest, I peered, trying to discern any signs of who or what could have committed such an act. My rifle became my only ally in this struggle against the unknown. I loaded it, sensing that soon this weapon might become the last line of defense in this strange dance with the unfamiliar. Yet even armed to the teeth, I realized that I didn't know what I was truly facing, and that my cabin, once considered a refuge, was becoming a trap in something beyond my comprehension. The gray glow of the sunset slowly penetrated through the tree trunks as I ventured into the forest once again, armed with my rifle and a heightened sense of invisible danger. The nocturnal sounds, tracks, and the severed line continued to disturb my peace, and my work became increasingly tense. I moved forward resolutely only when the sun ascended into the heavens. One day, pushing through the dense foliage, I felt eyes upon me. Something unseen lurked in the forest, weaving among the trees like mist, yet I couldn't discern its distinct outlines. My heart slowed its rhythm and I scrutinized the surrounding darkness, trying to spot the shadow standing in the shade. I continued to work, but only in the daylight. Every sound, every movement of the trees could be signs of an approaching unknown. The rifle became my guide and support, yet even with armed hands I felt vulnerable in the face of this mysterious entity that seemed to observe every step I took. One day, looking up towards the impenetrable part of the forest, I noticed it, something covered in thick black fur, towering over 2.5 meters with humanoid features. The gaze of the entity and mine intersected for a moment, freezing the blood in my veins. I sprinted towards my cabin, daring not to look back, and spent the entire night inside, awaiting the next day, relying solely on the sunlight, the only ally in this struggle against something that lurked in the shadows. With the dawn, as the first rays of the sun pierced through the branches, I resolutely decided to uncover what lurked in the depths of this forest. My experience as a forester and hands armed with a rifle carried confidence, but even the boldest confront the unknown. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, where even the most seasoned hunter rarely ventured. And there, amidst thick undergrowth, I saw it. It was something that defied description. A creature from the realm of nightmares. The face, flattened and covered in fur, resembled a nightmarish hybrid of a bear and a human. Its anatomy seemed grotesque and alien. A wide mouth with sharp teeth added horror to this strange being. The creature remained oblivious to my presence and continued moving deeper into the forest. My legs pulsed with determination and I decided to follow it. At some point I startled a nearby flock of birds and the creature noticed me. It turned out to be even more intimidating and massive than I had thought. Now standing before it, I realized its unnaturalness and understood that I was facing something beyond the scope of my experience. Gigantic, vivid orange eyes stared at me intensely, and I felt a chilling gaze piercing my soul. The creature was like a living nightmare, a creation that seemed out of place in this world. My resolve wavered and terror took hold as I realized that my rifle, once capable of handling bears, now seemed powerless against this entity. A gunshot shattered the silence of the forest, and in that moment, I felt the fate of this strange creature become inextricably linked with mine. Its cry pierced the air, filling it with an ominous echo. However, despite visible signs of pain, it did not immediately fall. Instead, the creature darted into the forest, its shadow disappearing among the trees. A mix of adrenaline and fear compelled me to run back to the cabin. Sounds echoed behind me, intensifying with each step I took. Suddenly, I realized that the creature I had shot had decided to seek revenge. Its swift footsteps drew nearer, and I could feel my body drenched in cold sweat. For long minutes, I raced through the thickets, my heart pounding furiously and my lungs burning. The sounds of pursuit became more persistent, as if the creature had transformed into an unseen force ready to engulf me. As I approached the cabin, I felt my strength draining from my legs. My gaze anxiously scanned the surroundings, trying to catch any signs that I was undoubtedly being pursued. The creature was determined not to let me go, and I knew that my life once again depended on the sole decision I could make in that moment. My legs, as heavy as stones, finally reached the cabin. With the last reserves of adrenaline, I forcefully slammed the door, creating a reliable barrier between me and the monster that was pursuing me. Yet even through the thick wooden door, the sounds of its ominous roar penetrated. The silence in the forest was shattered by this howl emanating from the depths of the woods, filling the air with fear and apprehension. I had to make a difficult decision. Either stay in the cabin and confront something I couldn't even see or gather the last of my strength and escape. Hearing the creature beginning to break down the door, I realized I had no choice. I fired all the rounds from the chamber towards the doors, and the bullets pierced the wood with a dull, unsettling creak. The creature screamed in pain, and I heard its footsteps receding. It was only a temporary respite, and I understood that the monster would return, ready for cruel vengeance. Deprived of choices, I reloaded the rifle and sprinted in the opposite direction into the forest, seeking salvation. 15 kilometers from my cabin lay a village, my only chance for rescue. Fear consumed me, and I ran through thick thickets, feeling my life hanging by a thread. My legs, almost refusing to obey, carried me through the darkness of the forest. The sounds of the creature's enraged cries behind me emphasized that it was not intending to retreat. With each step, the darkness thickened, and I could hear the evening chorus of nature being replaced by the ominous howl of my pursuer. Exhausted and frightened, I reached the village, where the surprised and fearful residents let me into one of the houses. There, as I caught my breath, I heard an old grandmother of the village begin to unveil ancient legends about the master of the forest, a being capable of regeneration and impervious to mortal weapons. She recounted how many hunters had disappeared in this forest, attempting to hunt the master. However, having ventured into these dark lands, I had encountered it face to face and managed to survive. It was astonishing for me to learn that the creature indeed was the master of the forest, and it wouldn't let me leave so easily. That night, I realized that I had witnessed something beyond the bounds of reality, and I had managed to escape certain death. Yet this story remained in the depths of the forest, in that dark realm where the echoes of the ancient creature's howls resound, its secrets shrouded in mystery like the darkness of this enigmatic corner of the world. If you want to understand why I left the place I was at, you're really just going to have to hear the entire story. You won't believe it, of course, but your skepticism means nothing. Because what I saw that night on the bayou has been with me ever since. In my mind, in my thoughts, and sometimes even in my dreams. It exists as a disturbing memory that I cannot shake away, that will never go away just so long as I live. It will be one of those things so terrifying that it'll still be just as keen in my mind on my deathbed as it was the day it occurred. But whether or not you believe me, I'll tell it to you anyway, if not only to serve as a warning, a plea for caution, if you ever find yourself near the swamps late at night. At the time, I was working at a shitty little fast food place. The only thing worse than working at a shitty fast food place is working at a shitty fast food place on the night shift by yourself without a vehicle, especially when you just so happen to live in the heart of rural Louisiana. Such was my case some years ago, the night this event happened to me. During this time, I lived quite a few miles away from the restaurant I worked at, and due to my lack of a vehicle or any access to a public bus system, I was dependent on others for my transportation to and from work. One night, after a busy evening of serving customers, I closed the store and locked up the restaurant. When I phoned for my ride, nobody answered. Now, I'm not here to throw a pity party, but I can't help but to express anger at the fact that the person who drove me to and fro to work was my roommate, who had a car but no fucking job. And I was basically the only person in our house who paid the rent at this time. And this loser had the carelessness to fall asleep, leaving me with no fucking option but to walk again. This was not the first time that this had happened. The first time this had happened, it took me an hour and a half to get home, walking briskly. And to those of you who have never been to the rural regions of Louisiana, you have no clue. Here we have what is called a bayou. It's basically swamp. Thick, murky, moist, frog-laden, mosquito-swarming, gator-infested, crappy-smelling swamp, with thick, tall grass, cattails, cypress trees, and heaves of pond scum. And I just so happened to live on the bayou, all the way down a long dirt road with hardly any streetlights and thick swamp on both sides of the road. There are no side roads, and the houses down this street are separated sometimes by more than a quarter-mile apart. It's not merely spooky walking down this road at night. It's fucking terrifying. You hear sounds, both real and imagined, coming from the bayou. Chirping, croaking, howling, grunting animals. The rustling of leaves and branches in the canopy of the cypress trees, and the splashing water from underneath them. That's the worst. You can hear the sound of something lurking nearby abruptly dunk underwater. It can be a turtle, a snake, or an alligator. You never know. You just keep walking with your teeth and hands clenched tight, hoping nothing crawls through the tall grass next to you and onto the road. Or, even worse than the subtle dunking sounds, the sudden splashes that happen when you're walking and scare a toad or frog and it jumps into the water. The sound makes you almost shit yourself as you begin a running spree that lasts about 3 seconds before you realize what it was. And then you're left with your heart pounding so hard that the sound of your blood gushing in your temples scares you just as much. These are the types of things that happen when you're in the bayou. This is what I had to look forward to that night as my asshole roommate slept sprawled out on the sofa with the television set probably tuned into reruns of the Three Stooges and the Marx Brothers. And don't get the impression that I simply called once and gave up. You can trust that his cell had around 7 or so missed calls, 3 very unfriendly voicemails, and several aggressive text messages. I could just imagine his phone laying in another room of the house, softly vibrating in my desperate attempts to reach him as he snored. But eventually I gave up, and having just about no other friends to contact in the area as a recourse, I stopped by the nearby gas station, grabbed an energy drink, and began my ways back home. Now you must understand the first 30 or so minutes of my walk isn't that bad. I'm still in the most populated part of town, and there are streetlights, stores, houses, and cars passing by in large numbers. That's important. If there are a lot of cars going by, you feel safer than when there are very few cars going by. Because when there are only 1 or 2 cars that pass you every 3 minutes, that means that there could be a psychopath in one of those cars, and they may have enough time to stop by and murder you without being caught. But if there are a lot of cars around, there may be psychopaths passing by, but they'll most likely not kill you then because there are too many people around to witness the crime. At least that's my reasoning. I digress. No psychopaths pulled up next to me as I walked about this part of town. Next, there comes a time in my journey where I have to turn down several suburban neighborhoods and walk some streets to get where I am going. And here's where things get a little less safe, and I have to be a little more cautious. There's less traffic down these roads, and you never know when some punk or gang may be hanging out in some empty lot or house, who might mess with you or try to pick a fight or mug you or just take an empty bottle of malt liquor and bash your skull in. You know, as an initiation ritual or something. These are the thoughts that go through my head as I walk this region, and they keep me on my toes, until I reach the point where houses become fewer and fewer, and the bayou begins. This is where the dirt road leading to my home is, and that's where I found myself this night on foot. I look down the narrow road. You can only see so far before it fades into misty darkness. I resented that I would have to spend the next hour walking its distance until I reached home. But anger took hold of fear when I thought about how all of this could be spared, if not for the neglect and carelessness of my roommate. When I got home, I was really going to have it in for him. I truly considered at that time the possibility of physically smacking his damn face, and with this thought in mind, I launched defiantly down the road, and the further I walked, the darker it became, until no light shined but the stars and a sliver of the moon above me. Very soon the sound of any vehicle was completely non-existent. There was just me, the road, and the bayou, and whatever creatures dwelt there. I heard the crickets chirp and the frogs croak and the occasional bird coo. To avoid fear, I focused on their chorus and let their sounds preoccupy my mind. I walked watching my shoes press into the sandy dirt as I placed one foot in front of the other. I would count my steps until I reached 100, and then I'd begin again. I tried to lose myself in the repetition. My shoes became damper and damper, and I felt the soles of my feet become moist. I stopped counting to ponder whether I should smack my roommate with a wet sock, but my thought was interrupted when I glanced up for a moment and saw that I was not alone on this road. A sharp panic seized my heart and I became very nervous. A long distance up ahead of me, I could discern the soft silhouette of a figure. It was so far away that I couldn't tell whether it was moving ahead or in my direction. I froze, and I could feel the blood gushing in my temples. What were the chances of there being some malicious punk wandering the street at night looking to rob me or pick a fight? This was the reassuring thought I had as I tried to convince myself that I was safe. I tried to keep calm, to not let my nerves get the best of me. I mean, whoever this was probably just as frightened of the prospects of me as I was of them, if they had already detected me. That is, I didn't know what to do. Run? There was only 2 directions. Continue walking. What were the risks? As I stood there, I saw that the figure was indeed moving in my direction, and its form was becoming more defined. And this was the time I began to notice how awkward it was moving. The figure didn't walk normal. It didn't bob up and down, like how a normal person looks like as they walk. What was coming towards me, it would seem from my perspective, moved in short, quick, jerking movements. And I could see from what light was present how its twitchy limbs projected from its torso, and how it was getting closer. and how its head stuck out from a neck that was longer than any human neck should be, and how at this time I could now faintly hear the noises that it seemed to make, the sound of suckling, and how it was moving quicker, and how its face lifted and I could see its eyes glare like glowing yellow beads, and how these wide, beady eyes locked onto mine staring at me, and how it stopped, and how we both were there, motionless yards away, looking at each other, and how it then let out the most ungodly inhuman screech I have ever heard, like a pig being gutted. It squealed violently, and the sound resounded through the bayou, and the chirping and croaking of crickets and frogs stopped. Everything stopped, and the rumbling and humming was all that could be heard afterwards. The rumbling and humming of a motor ahead, a vehicle speeding towards us, tires racing loudly. The thing in front of me hunched over and turned to see the headlights beaming our way. It hissed, getting down on all fours, only pausing for a moment to turn back towards me, gawking at me with its wide eyes before crawling hastily into the swamp. The vehicle that scared the thing away was my roommate's car. He never saw it, whatever it was, and I never wanted to see it again. I moved as soon as I could, and haven't been there since.